Hi. They actually gave me a script this time, so I'm going to try to stick to it. I'm Peter Beinart. I'm a professor here at the CUNY Graduate Center and the CUNY Journalism School. Tonight marks the final event in our 8-part First 100 Days programming, a series designed to help navigate this new political era. Conversations over the past few weeks delved into timely topics like immigration, activism, trade, power, economics, and other themes. They all featured CUNY experts as well as outside thinkers and leaders. This discussion is emblematic of what we do all the time at the CUNY Graduate Center, this incubator of vigorous debate, reflected in our doctoral and master programs, our 30-plus centers and institutes, and the dozens of events held here every week. So, now, like our president, I will be more freeform. We are very, very lucky to be joined tonight for a conversation, the last conversation about President Trump's 100 days by Jennifer Rubin, a very well-known opinion writer at the Washington Post, and Jelani Cobb, who writes for The New Yorker and teaches at a journalism school to the north of here. So I thought before getting to the topic of the moment, which is healthcare or the lack thereof, that I would start by asking both of our panelists a little bit to reflect a little bit on a personal level, on a human level, about what it was like for them when they realized that Donald Trump was going to be the next president of the United States. And the reason I thought of this is that I actually don't really remember a lot from that night and the following day. But one of the things I actually do remember was the tweet that Jelani sent out at 8:19 the morning after the election, which just was arresting to me because it got at just something kind of at a gut primal level, the sense of this event in the context of the long history of our country. So I want to read it to you and ask you, Jelani, just to reflect a little bit on that moment and what Trump's election was like for you and how it's affected you. And then I'll ask the same of you, Jennifer. So the tweet was, quote, "My great-grandparents were slaves. I choose to stay, to stand, and to fight."
So first, thank you for the invitation, and Jennifer, it's good to finally meet you. I've read you, and in regard to that tweet, there's actually a backstory to that, which is that I was in North Carolina the day of the election, and I was writing about what was going on in North Carolina. You know, there's been a lot of back and forth with the legislature and a lot of issues around voter access, and I was interested in seeing how that played itself out on Election Day. And it so happened that there was a Trump rally in North Carolina that day. And I went, and I am not someone that typically worries a great deal about my safety. But I actually worried about my safety in that environment. Even though there were other black people who were there who were Trump supporters, a small number of them. But the environment and the climate there was so volatile, it seemed to me. And it wasn't simply the idea of someone validating their ideas or speaking on their behalf, which I could understand, but it was also the kind of misogynistic commentary and the T-shirts and all these things that they're saying, the vile language, that this was not about politics, it was about some other kind of psychological reference that was happening there. And so I remember leaving, and I actually brought a friend of mine who left, another black male. He was like, I can't be here, and he left. And then I remember leaving and saying that whatever this is has to be stopped. And 8 hours later, we were seeing kind of all hell break loose in Michigan and Wisconsin. and were saying that this is something that might actually happen. And so I was terribly shaken. And so the context of that, which I've actually never spoken about publicly, is that I spoke to David Remnick, who's the editor of The New Yorker, and I was telling him about filing. And I said, this is the beginning of something horrific, that they're going to be people who have to flee the country because of what's being unleashed here. And I remember David said to me, we can't allow it to come to that. And, it's in my mind very clear, like, this is a Jewish guy talking to a black guy, like, very familiar with what the historical references for what we're talking about is. And so I kind of wrestled with that. And then the next morning when I tweeted that, that was actually what Paul Robeson said to the McCarthy Committee. When Joseph McCarthy's, it was the House Un-American Activities Committee, when they said to him, if you like the Soviet Union so much, why don't you leave and just live there? And he said, because my parents were slaves. And he said, no fascist-minded person will drive me from the country that they built. And that was what I was referencing there.
Interesting. And there have been people who've been fleeing the United States to Canada to seek asylum. Jennifer, what was it like for you that evening and the next day? What was, at a personal level, what was it like for you as a conservative? I don't know if you identify as a conservative, but someone who was very critical of Trump, despite having some association with the Republican Party. What was it like for you?
Well, I actually had to physically leave the Washington Post offices. I couldn't take it anymore. There was a pall that had fallen over the office. And the only thing I can compare it to, perhaps this is too dramatic, but from a personal standpoint, was 9/11. That you felt that everything that came before was different than everything that was going to come after. And that it was something so catastrophic, so monumental, that this was not going to be just another election. And what I was going to be doing was not just covering a new president. I think on an even more personal level, I think, like many of my colleagues, it shook me to my core because I thought I knew America. I thought I understood American values, and I thought I understood that we're a large, diverse, decent people that at times is struck with emotions on one side or the other, or is taken flights of fancy, but essentially is the image of the level-headed American, the good hail fellow who returns to basic decent values. And the result was something that I could not square with my image of the American people. And so I still wrestle with this. How can it be that Americans could have done this, just as I now agonize over what Trump is doing to the country? And there is this large debate, maybe we'll talk about it, as to whether this was some sort of expression of economic dislocation and sort of transition to a global economy that left people feeling unloved and abandoned, or whether this was something deeper and darker, and really that we had not turned over the rock in a very long time, and now we turned over the rock and this was it. So I think all those emotions and all that sense of discombobulation and questioning the country, my fellow Americans, the journalistic profession, sort of all began then. And I must say, I think, at least from my standpoint, I'm still wrestling with that as we kind of work through that. And what does it mean now to sample public opinion? What does public opinion mean now? How do we evaluate? What does democracy mean if people still support and really don't care about the substance of anything? That it's all become this sort of cathartic exercise. The it is out of the box, and everybody is now kind of feeding off of each other's raw emotion. So it was it was bad that night, but it hasn't gotten that much better, I have to admit. And it's, we can talk about this. In some ways it's worse than I thought, in some ways it's better than I thought.
That's actually exactly where we wanted to go. Jelani, in what ways do you think, it's still relatively early, but in what ways so far would you say that your fears have been realized or even exceeded, and in what ways have they not been realized?
And so it's interesting, we're having this conversation about America's, position in the world and its moral authority, but we are now kind of talking in congratulatory tones, to the president of the Philippines with the kind of horrific human rights abuses. So it's not just the tacit loss of moral authority, it's the active kind of shuttling away of moral authority. And so the idea of American morality and American democracy is kind of like a comb over. It's like a poor attempt to camouflage something that everyone can see, and is now apparent. We're going like, there's no there. It's like kind of worst case scenario. And I think the thing that has been heartening is that in some ways Trump and Trumpism has been a stress test for American institutions. And so the judiciary, which, here's the other thing that I think that played out in a way that people talked about on election night and shortly thereafter, saying these people don't know anything about government. And that really did not allay my fears until I realized that just on a basic level, they didn't even understand judicial review. And so they thought that the president issued executive orders as kind of fiats. And they were immediately frustrated when they found that they couldn't do just anything they wanted to do. And even with having the majorities in both houses, they still wound up with their first healthcare attempt going up in flames, saying, no, there actually is a science to this. There actually is a thing here. And so the lack of information, the lack of knowledge is not a virtue. But I still am tremendously worried about what the intemperate psychology of Donald Trump will do, especially in international affairs, especially with North Korea.
What about you, Jennifer? In what ways have your fears been realized? In what ways have they not been realized?
I would agree that I think American institutions, with the exception of Congress, are holding up pretty well. The courts, just about everyone that heard one of the travel ban cases, held its ground. The president, as he does with every institution and every adversary, attempts to bully the courts, and that's been wholly unsuccessful, even with his own Supreme Court nominee. So I think that has held, and more importantly, the free press is held, and there is a sense of renewed activism and determination. And you can say it's desperation, you can say it's anger, whatever it is, but people are not hiding under their beds. They are out in the streets, they are at town hall meetings, they are donating and giving of their time and money to a whole variety of organizations that are dedicated to combating one or more aspects of the Trump phenomenon. And it is quite heartening because I think we've come to sort of view that Americans are sort of, well, we take a democracy for granted, we're lethargic, people check out, they're going to be subdued, they're just going to roll over, he's just going to waltz through. And to see the resistance, as they've called themselves, has been quite remarkable in some ways, quite heartening. It's been worse in a lot of ways, too. And I think it's been worse because you realize how little principle and really human decency counts in politics, how strong the tribal urge to circle around the leader is. Everyone has to be on a team, and if your team is a little crazy, well, so be it. You got to take one for the team. You got to do this for the team, and even at the price of real human tragedy in some respect. And that has been dismaying. I don't want to say I've lost friendships over this, but I I have lost respect for innumerable people because I am not in the majority, if you've noticed, on the Republican side, or whatever I am now. I'm not a Republican anymore, but Senate right side. Most people have sort of made their peace or sort of rationalize what he is doing. Well, we'll get this, or we'll get deregulation, it'll all be worthwhile, or we got a Supreme Court justice out of it. This very sort of small thinking, transactional view of this president without any sense of the morality of the moment, of the danger to the republic. And that has been much worse and much harder to stomach. On the positive side, I've made a lot of new friends. And I think we can talk about this a little bit. I think there's a great opportunity actually for collaboration and renewal from center left to center right now, because I think we have much more in common with one another than we do with our respective fringes on the ends of the parties.
Just let me ask you about that. You talked about the resistance as a source of, something that gave you a sense of hope, but most of those people who see themselves in the resistance are on the left. I mean, their vision, I would imagine, about their vision of the role of government in the economy, their vision about the kind of American culture they want, the vision about the kind of role of America they want in the world is very, very different than yours, right? So I'm interested in what it means for you that they're a source of hope, and what you mean when you say there's a source of collaboration. Have you, in the wake of Trump, rethought anything that you believed before Trump, or are you hoping that the people on the left will rethink things that they believe?
It's a great question. I think there are two aspects to it. One is that I have had to return to first principles. I look forward to the day when James Fallow and I can argue about economics and about Israel. I look forward to the day when I can criticize the latest white paper that's come out of the Center for American Progress. I hope we return to that day. But there are fundamental aspects that come first, and that is protection of American democracy, American institutions. It's something as simple as the truth, as a defense of factual inquiry and factual corroboration. So that I think, and in some ways I think, as I see it, liberals have discovered that as well. We now have a joint appreciation for the strength of the Constitution, for basic structural constraints on the executive. Both parties are guilty of this. When you have the White House, you want to have the executive do lots and lots of things. And that happened under President Bush, it happened under President Obama, it's certainly happening now. But right now we have a shared interest in that. I think I've tried to be a little bit more consistent in seeing the executive as a branch of government that should be less independent, if you will, less powerful than it has come to be in the modern American state. So I think there's lots of things that we can agree on. And I think simply the reaffirmation of facts, of certain things that just aren't so. That you have the sense that we're all being gaslighted by the president, and to find other people who say, no, didn't happen, or no, that's not right. Whether it's trivial things, whether it's big things, whether it's things about him, whether it's things about their doing, whether it's things about the world. So I find, comfort in that. And I also think sometimes, particularly in Washington, we magnify differences of degree in ways that are distorting. Most of the people that I'm now commiserating with, do believe in American free enterprise. They want a little bit more regulation, I want a little bit less. These are matters of degree in many instances. And I think the differences there, I think I see in better proportion, better perspective now. I must also admit that I've always been a sort of iconoclastic Republican. I've always been very much in favor of immigration, for example, and free trade, which used to be liberal and then was conservative, and now no one likes it. So I think I was not necessarily the typical Republican, but I think perspective, priorities, and fear have kind of been a collaborative juice that's kind of brought people together.
Can I add something to that really quickly? To your point, I think one of the things that's frightening to me, is horrifying to me, is that there is no barrier anymore. So there is no disgrace that disqualifies you for the presidency, and that you can actually put together an electoral majority based upon demagogic behavior. And so we always could say, within certain parameters, that the great demagogues of American, history were generally corralled by a kind of immune response. That you could have Joseph McCarthy, but even the Republican Party, his own party, brought him down, recognizing the danger that he posed. Or a George Wallace could exist, but not be elected president. And so you could have a Huey Long, or the characters that we know, that we're familiar with, that have this lineage in American life. But now you can no longer say that someone can traffic in misogyny, in racism, in religious bigotry. Someone can ridicule someone with a disability. Someone can confess to things that equate to sexual assault, and that all these things can be excused, and that person can gain the ultimate authority in society. That's a terrifying thought to me. And the other part of it, too, is I think that there's a part of this narrative about the suicidal left that is implicated in this as well. Because even on going toward the election, I was still hearing lots of people who were saying, on the left, who were saying there was essentially no difference between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And so even outside of the various positions you might stake out in relationship to capitalism or markets or any of the policy positions you could talk about, Hillary Clinton's fundamental sanity was not in question. And we just saw this group of psychologists and psychiatrists at Yale who said they could no longer hold their silence, and that they thought something was actually wrong with the person who was in the chief executive of this country. And so the inability for people to even recognize that distinction is troubling, and I think it's a basic crisis around our understanding of civics and democracy.
I just want to follow up on this, and this metaphor of the immune system, right? So that our immune system had weakened somehow so that it wasn't able to quarantine and stop this threat. I think most people, if you'd ask them, I think a lot of people during the Obama era would have said, well, our immune system has been getting better in the sense that, public tolerance for expressions of naked bigotry, are lower than they were, in the 1950s or 1960s. What explains the fact that our immune system actually turned out to be weaker than it had been in these earlier moments in American history?
Okay, so there was this thing that happened in 2008, all right, where a black guy ran for president and he got elected, and nobody expected that to happen. It was not within the purview of anybody who studies this stuff. No political scientists, historians, nobody was saying that this is about to happen. And I think we took it to be indicative of much broader trends than were necessarily the case. It's also the case that, right after the election, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who works in politics and has worked in politics for a really long time, and he said, you do know that there's going to be a backlash to this. And this was when everyone was exuberant, and you couldn't really say this out loud because they accused you of being kind of like a buzzkill. But he was like, you do know there's going to be a backlash to this. And I said, yeah, I know. And he said, and you do know the Voting Rights Act is done. And I said, yeah, I know. You're probably right. And both of those things proved to be true. And there were people who looked at this where, just knowing the history of this country, when there has been a moment in which black people seem to gain a closer degree of acceptance, it has always been followed by a backlash that looks something like what that Trump rally looked like when I was in North Carolina. and nobody could know what the form would be, but it wasn't that hard to know that it was coming. And the other thing is that it was actually indicated in polling that, you know, starting in the Obama kind of outset, there was a small number, but a number that grew over the course of his 2 terms, of white people who, when polled about disadvantages in society, would say that whites are the most disadvantaged group in American society. And this was laughable at first, and then when it actually started becoming pluralities and majorities in some polls, it stopped being funny, because you understood that this was about racial resentment, and it was very transparent that people were beginning to see something that holds up, equates to no indicator, no data points to this being true, but the emotional index of it was that this was very true for people.
You know, it's interesting, looking at the right just sort of tear itself apart, turn itself into pretzels with hypocrisy. 10 or even 5 years ago, if you said, you know, there's this group of people, and there's been a breakdown in the family, a lot of them are unemployed, they're on disability, you know, they don't work in great numbers, they're addicted to the latest drug. Are these people really, you know, sort of victims of globalization? They would have said, of course not. Those people can pick themselves up, get a job, and get back in the game. You know, they've done it to themselves. Okay, it's a perspective, but I've just described, you know, what we're all now supposed to be angst-ridden about, which is, you know, the segment of white, you know, rural, working-class America. So, you know, it's very interesting how the perspective of victimization and who's a victim and how you get to be a victim has kind of played out. I look at it a little bit differently in that I think this is the result of a long series of trends coming together at a given time. You can't have an education system as insufficient and as unequal as ours and explain people to, from the osmosis, learn civic virtue and civic values. You cannot have a public culture as crass, as rude, as in some cases hateful as ours, and not have that affect people's sense of what is appropriate public behavior. And by the same token, you know, this is not just America, it's across the board. I'm not saying anything all of you don't know, that institutions as a whole have really taken it hard, that we live in an age of cynicism and skepticism and you know, sort of doubt, and I think it has been very hard when someone who is in a mainstream of an established party to try to appeal to people's sense of sort of normalcy, of continuity, whether it's in France, where you don't have any of the traditional parties that have made it to the final round, or whether you have a candidate like Donald Trump. Established democratic institutions have not held up very well over the last several decades. And I think all these things came together. And you know, the other thing I try to remind irate readers and fellow conservatives is, you know, if 78,000 people had gotten off the damn couch and gotten to vote, we wouldn't be having this conversation. It was a very small margin. And so all of us are in the job of deploying a narrative, making sense of this chaotic situation. But we can also overinterpret and overanalyze. And every election is made up of specific events, and every election is made up of specific candidates who have flaws and virtues. So lest we get too carried away, I bet if you polled those 78,000 people in those 3 states, they have, if they had had their evening back, they would have gone out and voted, and we might not be here today. So there is a danger in oversimplifying and over-dramatizing an election where he did not get the popular vote, and it was so narrow even in the Electoral College.
I just want to push you on this, though, a little bit. So let's talk about the the people who've lost in globalization, right? White people who've lost in globalization who voted for Donald Trump. So the traditional progressive left answer to those people would be the government's got to help them. The government's got to put in money and do various things to try to give them a better chance, better social safety net, better opportunity. The conservative answer has been, as you know, is basically get rid of the government restraints that are keeping them from succeeding. Get the government off their back and give them some tough love about the way in which they've got a screwed up culture. Tell them to work harder and stay married and all these things. But it seems to me the lesson of Trump is that that traditional conservative answer doesn't have much of a constituency because what Donald Trump said to those people was, no, government's going to help you. We're going to help you by keeping the Mexicans out, by keeping, if you want to be crass about it, by keeping blacks down, and by keeping, the jobs from being shipped to China. So, as someone who I think is actually sympathetic to that more traditional conservative message, what we thought about conservative message, do you feel like you need to rethink it? It doesn't seem like it has much of a constituency outside of the American Enterprise Institute.
I've actually been making this argument for some time now, that modern conservatism calcified in 1980, and you knock on any door at any think tank, and they say the same thing they did in 1980. It's like Rip Van Winkle, and it doesn't matter what the issue is. The answer is cutting marginal tax rates. It doesn't matter what the answer, what the question is. The answer has to be social conformity. Whatever you do, that it has calcified, and we have. There's even a phrase for it that people use now, which is brain-dead conservatism, and that this was a problem for a long time. It's why, in my view, they lost some elections they should have won, and it is a result of not thinking creatively enough about the ways in which conservatism and some of the principles that underlie it, which are also ways about governance, modesty, incrementalism, restraint, all those virtues that we used to look to, remember, for conservatives before they became radical and extremist, and a bunch of, Jacobites. So I think this has been a problem for a long time. And I think there are certainly a strain of conservatives who still think that, who have a sort of libertarian perspective. I have thought for a long time that conservatives did themselves no good by attacking the safety net and by calling for a strain of purity that was not acceptable, was not feasible in a complex society. I think where I sort of got off the train with the Trump voters was, first of all, they had a higher median income than Hillary voters. So many of these people were simply rich conservatives who decided that they were victims because people didn't say Merry Christmas to them, or they decided they were victims because the people at the Oscars made fun of traditional values, or whatever this is. And so, I think we have to put that to one side. And those people really have nothing to complain about. I'm going to be very blunt. But I also come back to a more fundamental issue. We're talking about kind of fundamentals. People have agency. People have the ability to make decisions. We didn't say, in retrospect, that the poor people of Germany during the Weimar Republic, who had struggled so badly, who had those, bushels of Deutschmarks, well, of course they had a right to lash out. Of course they had a right to look for the other, to blame their problems. And we don't function this way in historical terms or in personal terms. Whatever the issues may be, we as Americans do not have the right to express our political desires at the expense of other people's rights and of truth. And so this attitude that I can do and I can say whatever I want because my factory closed down in, Cleveland, I just don't buy it. And I do have empathy, and many of us have been suggesting a whole bunch of stuff, none of which have anything to do with, by the way, what Trump is proposing, which is going to make everything worse, because, as we know, you know, immigration is actually good for the economy and actually helps grow the economy, and free trade, opening markets is good for an exporting country like America. So there's something that he's recommending that's actually responsive to them, frankly. And so some of the things I have held dear to, including on trade, including on immigration, which I consider to be classical conservative principles, I still advocate. And they're not popular because people have decided to believe what they're going to believe, but I still do believe them. I do think that on a number of issues, many of my fellow conservatives have not realized there is no constituency for that. We can talk about the health care, but who in America is in favor of this? Who in America is now, has accepted the notion that we should go back to having people who do not have insurance coverage? People who believe that this is what Americans have been yearning for, that we want to go back to the era of uninsured people. I don't know who they are talking to. So I think they are in a time warp. I think they have not thought about these issues, grappled with these issues. You look at a lot of other countries. You look at the Conservative Party in Britain. You look at Macron in France, who's really a centrist, I would think, capitalist, but a centrist. People have been grappling with these issues and thinking creatively about problems for a long time. The American right has not. And this is what happens when you don't think about problems realistically and creatively.
I just like something really quick about that. So I think you struck on something on the cynicism, and to your point about healthcare, I think it ties to something bigger, where I think it was 17% people will agree with repealing Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. But I think that part of the thing about Trump and him saying that the government's going to help you in these particular ways is that he's a salesman. He'll say anything. Is not ideological. If he thought people wanted to hear, he's in it for the adulation. Well, I think he's in it for two reasons. One is the adulation, and the other is the money too. It's three things: the adulation, the money, and also the glee with which he can wipe clean the memory of Obama, of anything that Obama did. I think that to the extent that he's ideological, it is, what did Obama do? Then I'll do the opposite. And so I think that's kind of how we got here. But to your point about cynicism, I think that it's also important to recognize the way that Trump refracts that in some crucial ways, that he has no respect for any institution. But beyond that, he has no respect for anyone who sacrifices on behalf of an institution. So it made perfect sense that he would talk the way he did about the Khan family. It wasn't simply about the military, it's about a person who would sacrifice their life, which by Trumpian standards makes you a sucker. Because the entire ideal, especially for the con man, is that you come out on top, and anyone who doesn't is like they deserve what they get. And so I think that's the kind of moral logic that's implicit in what he's saying there. And when you look at kind of the moral ethics of con men, it explains a lot, I think, about how he has interacted and operated in his first 100 days in office.
And I think that's how you got people arguing, well, Hillary's just as bad. They're all crooks. You get this complete moral relativism. They're all crooks. They're all not going to do what you want them to, so he's no worse than these other people, which is nonsense. But that is born of a deep cynicism that they think that everyone's a liar, everyone's a thief, everyone's going to rip them off, and you wind up in this moral nihilism, which is where we are right now.
Jennifer was talking about the effect of Trump on the right and the causes of Trump on the right. I wanted to ask you what you think the effect of Trump will be on the left. There's what the backlash to the backlash is going to look like, and what the Democratic Party is going to look like, by the time the next Democratic presidential candidate comes along.
Well, I'm not entirely certain about this, because when we saw what happened with the DNC with Perez and Ellison, and when Keith Ellison lost, I thought that people would have kind of seen it as okay, Tom Perez went the extra mile to make sure that he was incorporated in, that people did not view this as a zero-sum kind of situation, but there were a substantial number of people who were still kind of railing about this. And it was frustrating to me because I thought, okay, look, this is not, it's still the kind of purity. Like, if I don't get everything that I want, then I don't want anything. And it's also a kind of closed-mindedness, I think, about the level of peril that we actually are potentially confronting now. And so that makes me a little bit worried about where the left will go from here. The other thing is, I think that's interesting is that I don't think that the dynamics that caused or enabled Trump and Trumpism are unique. And what I mean by that is we've had these conversations about America's changing demographics, and there's a historian by the name of John Sell who wrote a book called The Highest Stage of White Supremacy. And what he did was kind of compare societies in which the empowered class was, this is an old book from the early 1980s, but he compared societies in which the empowered class was the majority, and there was a minority that was on the bottom, and those in which the empowered class was the minority, and there was a majority on the bottom. And he pointed out a really kind of key point, which is that societies in which the powerful people are a small minority tend to be far more reactionary and far more rigid than the opposite. And so when we've had these conversations about this become the browning of America, I've kind of talked to people on the left and like, what makes you think that that's going to be a good thing in terms of what American politics look like? It's a chance that the more people look around, and there's been the argument, by the way, that what we're seeing now is a kind of 50-year response to the liberalization of immigration in 1965. If we see a society in which people of color and immigrants and people from the far-flung corners of the world actually outnumber white people, they exactly align with what the fears around that 1965 Civil Immigration Act was. And so we may be at the front end of an enduring political trend.
Especially if that minority can keep the significant members of that majority from voting.
True,
right?
and we should also, one other quick thing about this is that white people in America are 63% of the population. They currently hold 91% of the elected offices. There's no reason why that couldn't be the case with 49% of the population or 40% of the population.
Then we'll go to questions. Go ahead.
One of my favorite books that I recommend to everyone I talk to these days is Robert P. Jones, The End of White Christian America. And this is what he talks about, that for the first time, white Protestants are a minority in America. And they have been displaced culturally and socially, and a lot of this is this visceral reaction. It's bizarre for someone who's a member of a minority group, I'm Jewish, that you should be unnerved because you're a minority. Well, what difference does it make? You can practice however you want. Why do you have to be top dog? Why do you have to be in charge of everything? Boy, did I not understand that. And I think this perceived loss of status is what is at the root of a lot of this. And it's numerical, and it's cultural, and they are reacting in ways that we didn't think were possible in America.
Maybe something that Israeli Jews can understand better than American Jews. So let's go to questions. Do we have a microphone anywhere? Yes, we have a gentleman coming with a microphone. Yes, you in the blue, and just wait till the microphone will get to you soon.
Hi, I really enjoyed the talk here, and I'm wondering, sort of the elephant in the room, or could you talk about Fox News and how that's just going to keep I don't know how anything would ever change unless they changed, so.
Well, they are the primary culprit, I think, in creating this sort of fact-free, resentment-driven, sort of counterfactual world that has immersed many on the right. It's not just Fox, because we've had talk radio for a while, but Fox certainly magnified this tremendously. So perhaps we need to organize the Fox shareholders. There is a generational change. We'll see what comes out the other side of Fox. But I think it behooves people in the media, people outside the media, to figure out alternatives and figure out ways to respond to this, both in economic ways of protest. Why do you get a free pass if you are advertising on some other Fox show as opposed to just Bill O'Reilly's show when the entire organization was committed to essentially sexual assault? Why is that? Why are we all sort of going back to business as normal? Why aren't there consumer boycotts of the entire enterprise? So I think part of that is an activism, and part of that has to be a response from liberals and non-crazy conservatives to a media environment, and to really push back and to really establish that this is not news. This is not news. And it is a huge problem. It's not going to go away overnight.
It's interesting irony in a way that the left has the cultural power today to depose Bill O'Reilly, which it didn't even though it's politically weaker than it's ever been in terms of elected offices, right? Whereas in decades past, it was actually politically stronger in terms of numbers of governorships and state legislatures and members of Congress, but actually didn't have the cultural power. I mean, it's not a newsflash that Bill O'Reilly was a sexual harasser. That's been known for a really long time. So it's an interesting moment of kind of inversion between the left's kind of political weakness and its cultural influence. Other questions? Go ahead.
The election of Trump was caused, as you described...
Oh, sorry, wait, the microphone is coming.
The election of Trump was caused, as you described, by unleashing some underlying anger. Aren't we better off by getting Trump than getting somebody like Marie Le Pen, which was maybe Ted Cruz or something, which would have caused maybe a much more severe long-term harm than Trump, that is generating a lot of backlash, which might come quicker?
Well, we don't know what comes after Trump. And we don't know what kind of rule book he's established. And so he's exposed a terrible flaw in American democracy, and we don't know who or how that will be exploited in the future. So I'm not so sure that this is a short-lived thing, one. And the second thing is that, as bad as this is, I feel like the situation would have been far more dangerous domestically or internally had he lost. Because I think that there were people who were so invested with almost a kind of religious association with him that it's not inconceivable that there would have been acts of violence, especially if he said that the whole system was rigged and it was impossible for him to win.
Other questions? Go ahead, sir.
Hello. I have a question. Maybe someone could speak to it. The rebranding of racism, racist, and as and fascism as the new nationalism, and the globalization of that, because what's happening in America is happening in Europe and other places too, and it's being rebranded as a form of nationalism. The anti-immigrants all over the globe, the anti-Muslim, the anti-immigrants and so forth. So the globalization of nationalism also, quote, unquote, fascism.
Who wants to jump in on that?
Well, I think it begins with calling things for what they are. This is racism. This is not alt-right. This is not hard-right. This is not some convoluted, rationalization that you're going to come up with. That is cover talk. So I think calling it what it is the first step. And I think this is one of the things I was talking about, these basic fundamental issues that I think center-right to center-left have to return to, that we are not, as a society, going to tolerate that. We're not going to tolerate it in language and in cultural behavior. We're not going to tolerate it in policy terms. So I think that is one of the prime directives, one of the principal challenges for Democrats who are out of power and Republicans who are sort of stumbling around and don't feel like they have a party anymore, to return to some bright lines in American society about racism, about misogyny, that I think we've lost.
Let me just push you on that a little bit. So when you, as a conservative, or someone on the center-right, says that we need to return to a conservatism which is anti-racist, which has a bright line and says not accepting racism, a lot of people on the left would say, there's no usable past there. I mean, there's no there. I mean, you know, in the sense of Ronald Reagan at Oxford, Mississippi, talking about states' rights, or the Southern Strategy, or Newt Gingrich talking about the food stamp president. So where do you, as a conservative, go for your examples of the non or even anti-racist conservatism that you want to resuscitate?
Do I have to list somebody in the 20th century?
No, I mean, it's up to you, really.
There was Lincoln.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, or Edmund Burke, or these sort of folks. Listen, there are lots of individuals, either writ large or writ small, who you can point to who have been, sort of heroic, and we do forget the heroic Republicans in the Senate during the Civil Rights era, and we do forget the Northeastern and Midwestern white Protestant clergy that helped push civil rights legislation over the edge. So I think we can go back to lots of history. But in some sense, I think going back to an earlier age on racism may not be a good idea at all. That we simply have to invoke a moral absolute. And we simply have to say that if you do believe that the job of government is to protect rights and to allow for the self-realization of the individual, then you cannot be a racist. Those two things are inconsistent with one another. And so I think just on a theoretical basis, you have to return to first principles. And maybe that's the problem. Maybe we're all too vague about it. We need some better exemplars. But I think that's the message going forward. And I'm not sure it would help, frankly, to go back to the past anyway, because Americans have developed this phenomenal amnesia about recent history.
Can I just say really one quick question? Like, isn't it weird that these people are supposed to be nationalists, but Farage and Trump and Le Pen, they're all in like this mutual admiration society and endorsing each other and so on? It was like
and getting a check from Putin.
From Putin, right.
In that wild debate, I don't know if any of you caught it or speak French, last night in Paris, which was like just a mudslinging, hysterical sort of Saturday Night Live parody of a debate. I was dying for Macron to say, how are you a French nationalist? You took 9 million euros from Vladimir Putin. So it's counterintuitive, and that's because they see themselves as the true representative of the people, that they are beyond almost, the governments that have usurped the powers of the people, and they return to this sort of Christian nationalist, sort of Volk, history that they've made up. So, but you're right, it's bizarre, and I've sometimes asked my French and European friends, like, why don't you bring this up more? And I'm not sure what the answer is. Maybe they have bigger fish to fry, but it is completely inconsistent.
But why is it bizarre for hyper-nationalists to support hyper-nationalism in other countries, especially in other countries that they associate as white Christian countries, who they also fear are losing their white. I mean, Franco and
Well, then
Hitler and
sure,
Mussolini
sure.
saw,
Then-
saw
then-
identification with one
then
another.
If we're talking about white nationalism, certainly.
Right.
But if we're talking about these kinds of ethnic nationalisms, then no. They're being nationalist in the most globalist way possible. But that's not surprising to me. I'm just talking about the contradiction, which
Right.
they're replete with them.
Yeah.
You know, one of the reasons that Putin has the kind of appeal that he has to that sliver of like the really serious, committed ethno-nationalists of Trump is that they view him as a white nationalist, and
Right.
you know, there's that neo-nationalist movement and skinhead movement in Russia that has connections to the one here.
Right.
But that's not what they're saying. They're not saying white people first. They're saying America first. It's like, well, you know, or to them they think they're synonymous.
Right. Other questions? I see a hand in the back there.
What do you think of the media characterizing Trump, who's an out-of-touch billionaire elitist, as some populist hero, which I think is a piece of crap? And I'd like to know what you think of that nonsense about Trump is not a populist, yet the media keeps on using that phrase to describe him.
Let me say.
The media, I have written so many emails to the media saying, and I've given them a definition of what a populist is. It's the common person against the elites. And that's not Trump, and he's 70 years old, and he's never used his wealth to help anybody except himself. And I'd like to know why the media keeps on referring to him as a populist.
Well, I mean, he's leading what people are calling a populist movement. But here's the thing about him. Trump is rich, but he's rich in the way that poor people would be rich if they could be. So, like, the point is not the kind of genteel Upper East Side money. It's what's the point of being rich if you don't have your name in gold on the side of a building? If you don't accessorize, and I wrote a piece that was satirical, it was tongue-in-cheek at the beginning of Trump's candidacy, where I said Donald Trump is a rapper. And you know, the argument that I made there was that he flaunts his wealth, he conspicuously consumes, he accessorizes with beautiful women, and he owns a fashion line. And so it was like, if you looked at all those things, you check, those are all on the checklist of, rapper, which is, what he was more reminiscent of. And so it's perfectly fine. People will forgive him his wealth, the same way they did with Ross Perot. They will forgive you your wealth if they think that culturally you represent them or you share their same sorts of ideas.
You really think he's a populist? I don't.
I don't think he is, but I said I said he's leading a populist movement. I don't think that he is. I think that I don't think he has an ideology, and I think that his main interest is himself. But the movement that he is leading has these kind of populist tones.
Well, I disagree.
Right. Well, right-wing populism defines itself in opposition to cultural elites, not economic elites. Go ahead.
Why is it that the Clintons and the Obamas are not now speaking up against this atrocity? Like Bill Clinton is the most articulate politician of the second half of the 20th century. Why are they being silent and polite, and Trump is not polite?
Okay, so for those who didn't hear, why are the Clintons and the Obamas not speaking out more forcefully?
I think it's a strategic choice that they would only, this is exactly what he would love to do. Whenever, the news gets too bad for him, his poll ratings go down, he brings up out of thin air Hillary Clinton because that's, his favorite whipping girl. So I think they have made a decision that, for now they will support, and they're financially and otherwise supporting these causes. But to personally take him on is counterproductive at this point. And to some degree, I do agree with that. I think there needs to be a new generation of leadership. There is a new generation of leadership, and they have to begin to carry the ball now.
I have a question back here. I wonder if you could comment on the lasting effect of Trump's attack on transparency, whether it has to do with his tax returns or his refusal to divest from his businesses, or his hiring of his family members, who in turn didn't really divest from their businesses, his refusal to identify the people who have come to visit him at the White House, and the like. Is this going to be a low bar to be set for the future?
I've written about this a lot until I think people are probably sick of hearing about the emoluments clause from me. But it is a serious problem for exactly the reason that you said, because now people have the idea, well, he got elected president and didn't release his taxes. He hired his daughter and nothing happened. So they will continue to do this. I think there are a couple responses to that. First of all, there are the courts, and there's some creative lawyering going on out there. So if you're looking for people to devote time and money, I would recommend CREW, C-R-E-W, who is at the forefront of a lot of this financial litigation. So there are the courts. And we have an unfortunate situation now where you have a passive Congress because it is of the same party. And the solution to the problem that you have outlined is to flip one or both of the houses of Congress. That right now we have the worst of all possible worlds. So the problem can be corrected very easily if the Congress stands up and does something, because they have that power now. They're simply not doing it, and they're not doing it in a spectacularly hypocritical way. So aside from the courts now and vocalizing this, you really have to get better lawmakers, because they're the ones who have the power to enforce these and to pass new rules and requirements, and to return to a certain respect for, as you say, transparency.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for. So I want to thank Jennifer Rubin, thank Jelani Cobb, thank all of you for coming. And keep your eye out for future events at the CUNY Graduate Center.